Remember that when we've been talking about Nehemiah, we've been talking about a man who's in the middle of leadership tests. He is gripped by leadership issues, okay? The real work of God that he's involved in is what? What is he doing physically? He's rebuilding a wall in order to reestablish the heart and lifeblood flow back in Jerusalem. Now, what's interesting to me is that as they come and go, the whole idea of the book is not really about walls. It's really about leadership decisions he's making and deflecting and putting up shields and deflecting all of the problems that are coming at him. Now, what's interesting is you get down to chapter 7 and he begins organizing the people of God to become a blessing for God. And how does he do it? Chapter 7 begins with the process of getting people right before God with some administrative steps. I want you to notice the first thing he does, he installed long-term leaders. And I want to step back and see if we can see this. No matter how complex, God is the master of transforming people. And the real work of God isn't just about building assets, it's about changing people. Guys, you can build church buildings. That's easy. We can go to Haiti and build 40 new church buildings. Transforming people is what ministry is about. Building buildings, unsaved people who don't know God at all can build buildings. It's not about the building of buildings, it's about the changing of people. Now, what you have to be able to see in the story is, first thing he does is passes the command. A leader focuses on setting key players to move forward. Look at 7:1. After the wall had been rebuilt, and I had set the doors in place, the gatekeepers, the musicians, and the Levites were appointed. Look at those very carefully. The point of organizing the work isn't for the leader to be the end-all and be-all of the work. It's not, everybody come to me for everything. It's to train other people to assume the duties that God gifted them to do. Now note that the leader installed, after the crowning purpose of the work, he installs people who are functional. Look at what he does. The first person he installs is, after the doors are set in place, is what? The gatekeepers. That is the guards that let people come and go first. Then musicians and Levites? Seriously? Right after the guards, you put the police force in and then musicians? Why are musicians and Levites appointed next? Worship. So guard the people, then get the worship going, because the objective here was always about worship. Now in verse 2, look at the pattern. The leader installed long-term leaders and then recognized them in front of the people. Look what he does. I put in charge of Jerusalem my brother Hanani, along with Hananiah, the commander of the citadel, because he was a man of integrity and feared God more than most people do. Look what he does. He steps up and he goes, all right, I need to get the right people. So the worship team is in place, and now I need to get everybody set up who's going to operate the administration. Why? Because people that don't have an administration don't know what to do next. So he says, here's the bottom line. He's going to come and he's going to set it up, and he puts his brother in charge and then Hananiah in charge, and he says, these guys are good guys, and he publicly lets people know that they're in charge. The next thing he does in verse 3 is sets up the protection for the city. A leader sets up the procedures that protect the people. So what does he do? He said, I said to them, the gates of Jerusalem are not supposed to be opened until the sun is hot. While the gatekeepers are still on duty, have them shut the doors and bar them. Also appoint residents of Jerusalem as guards, some at their posts and some near their own houses. So, look, we all have gifts and personalities, and personally I like to create, but I hate to maintain. That's the reason why first person on my staff to hire was Matt. He likes to maintain. I'm not a keep the trains running on time. I like to build the train. I like to design the tracks and figure out where it's all going. And so I wouldn't make much of a conductor. Matt keeps the clocks running. I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in the big picture of where we're going. And everybody's got their gifts. And one of the works of a leader has to be to address policy development. And in verse 3, I see a development of policy. You got to tell people how things are to be done. Otherwise, if you just think they're going to know what you know, they're not going to know what you know. Just remember, the only person by chapter 7 who's been seasoned through all of the conflict is the guy who was in it. Nehemiah knows the seasoning of the conflict. The other guys he brings on, they may have been out there when the conflict happened, but they weren't the center seat. You know, it's easy from the cheap seats to figure out what the center seat should do, but when you're sitting in it, it's hard. And so here's what I know. There are all kinds of issues in a work created from God's burden and built amidst the enemy's opposition, but not the least of which is securing a long-term work. In a church, that includes making clear who's responsible for what area of ministry. One of the most important things you'll do when you build your team for ministry is make sure everybody understands the procedures we use and who's in charge. So verse 2 was who's in charge, and verse 3 is what the procedures are. Let me just say this. You build a daycare. What are you going to have to do? You're going to have to get a staff together, but you're going to have to make sure everybody understands the procedures and everybody understands who's in charge. And that's what he's doing. Okay? Then you get down to verse 4, and here's the problem of the city. A leader renewed evaluation of the difficulties ahead. Facing the problems are part of the task of a leader. So you don't just put everybody together and make policy and walk out the door. Look what he does. Now the city was large and spacious, but there were few people in it, and the houses had not yet been rebuilt. So it occurs to me that in each phase of a work's growth, there's a required new evaluation of problems and challenges. We are right now in our ministry, right here at Grace, going through one of these. It's not bad, it's good. We're reevaluating everything. So I think what he does here is very, very smart. But I want you to notice that in verse 4, he noted the problem. We're spread out and there's not a lot of people living in the city. Now, guys, don't stop there. Don't just tell everybody, here's the problem we have with our ministry. You will get people in any congregational meeting, well, this just is like this. This is just the way it is. Thump. Well, thank you. See, verses 5 and 6 follow verse 4. Isn't that good? Verses 5 and 6 are all about, he didn't just note the problem, he plotted a solution. People are about problems. Leaders are about solutions. So in verse 5, so my God put into my heart to assemble the nobles, officials, common people for registration by families. I found the genealogical record of those who had been the first to return. Remember that he's not first. They came back in 539 to 536. They've been there since 536. He's coming along in now it's 432. So he's 100 years after the first group got there. He said, I found the record of those who came. This is what I found written there. These are the people of the province who came up from the captivity of the exiles whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had taken captive. They returned to Jerusalem and Judah, each of his own town. Now, look at the components of the plan of Nehemiah. First, he felt God moving him toward the assembly of people and a new census so that he could ascertain what? What's he trying to get at? Guys, here's the problem. His observation is we're spread out too thin. We don't have enough people living in the walls. But his problem is he doesn't have enough facts. You want to be a good leader, before you pronounce what we should do, spend the time to figure out what you really do and don't know. Because all the time I have leaders coming to me that want to solve a problem, but they haven't yet put the facts together. I've got 3 different stories and I don't know what it is. Until I've got the facts, I cannot tell you what's going on. Okay, keep going down to end of verse 6, and notice he says, this is what I found written in verse 5, and he says, I went through the records, and you know what? He goes through and he's looking for what? He wants the captivity records of the exiles that Nebuchadnezzar had sent. Now, there was a restriction or a parameter that people had to fit into. Scripture taught that the inhabitants of the cities and the workers of the temple had to be from a certain pedigree. It wasn't Nehemiah's job to convince God that his word wasn't fair. It was Nehemiah's job to fit into his word. So look at verse 7. In the company with Zerubbabel, Joshua, Nehemiah, Azariah, Raamiah, Nahamani, Mordecai, Bilshan, Misperet, Bigvai, Nahum, Baanah, the list of the men of Israel. And then in verse 8, it says the descendants of, the descendants of, the descendants of, the descendants of. Go all the way down to verse 26, the men of Bethlehem and Netophah, the priests. Verse 43, the Levites. 44, the musicians. 45, the gatekeepers. 46, the temple servants. 57, the descendants of the servants of Solomon, the temple servants. Verse 61, those came from the towns of Milah, Harsha, Karub, Adon, Immer. Those they could not show their families were descended from Israel. Look at that and underline at the end of verse 61, they could not show their families were descended from Israel. I looked through everything, and I found that some of the people didn't have records that they were in fact members. They weren't part of Israel. They might have been, but they couldn't show that they were. Verse 64, these searched for their family records, but they could not find them, and so were excluded from the priesthood as unclean. Now look, Nehemiah followed the form that showed a knowledge of earlier record. The people were listed. It's interesting. As in Ezra 2, from generations before, they were listed in the exact same order. You might mark off next to this long list, this follows the pattern of Ezra 2. You know what he's doing? He's taking the previous Ezra statements all the way back from the 500s, and he's dragging them forward, and he's outlining, okay, let's see. Leaders, check. Families, check. Cities, check. Priests, check. Levites, check. Singers, check. Porters, check. Temple servants, check. Solomonic servants, check. Returnees without pure, decent records, check. Now, in order to help focus the group on the future, it's important for them to carefully review the past and understand what God had done to bring them to that point. Would people see their present and future challenges in light of their heritage? Yes. They're about to resettle a land. Do you remember a long set of classes in which we talked about even before Joshua got to the land, Moses had already divided up the land according to what? Tribes, and then according to families. So is your tribe and your family going to be important when you're resettling the land that's now empty? You betcha. So he understands what the problem is. Now, here's the thing. What do you do about the people with no pure descent records? What do you do with people who come in and go, but I know I'm a priest. I feel I'm a priest. My mom told me I'm a priest. I do priestly things. I think priestly dreams. I'm just a priest. But you've got no record that you're a priest. What do you do? How many of you want them to be priests because they really want to be? How many of you think it's going to be a real pressure to Nehemiah as they lean on him and say, but look how few priests they have, and we're so priestly in our priestliness. We're just priests. You got to understand, I know how I feel. I feel I'm a priest. And here's the thing. What he does is he doesn't try to decide whether God should have had the standard of pedigree. He just follows the standard of pedigree and tells them, if you don't have what you need, you can't serve. That's so mean. No, that's very biblical. Would you be open to the idea that God could save us a lot of problems if we would eliminate from the group of people trying to minister those who God said shouldn't? When you follow God's word, here's the thing, there's a protecting influence. He's protecting you from things you can't see. Now, I want you to notice the precision of the records. Go all the way down to verse 66. I know it's a quick run, but there's a lot of names in the passage. Get down to verse 66. The whole assembly together was 42,360. Besides their male and their female servants, of whom there were 7,337, and they had 245 male and female singers. Their horses were 736, mules 245, camels 435. Their donkeys were 6,720. Some from among the heads of the fathers' households gave to the work. The governors gave to the treasury 1,000 gold drachmas, 50 basins, 530 priest garments. Some of the heads of the fathers' households gave into the treasury of the work 20,000 gold drachmas, 2,200 silver minas. That which the rest of the people gave was 20,000 gold drachmas, 2,000 silver minas, and 67 priestly garments. Now the priests, the Levites, gatekeepers, singers, some of the people, temple singers, and all Israel lived in their cities. And when the 7th month came, the sons of Israel were in their cities. Hang on for it. The only thing I want you to see about those end verses, look how carefully he keeps record of exactly the inventory of what he has. As he writes the journal, he kept track of things. He gave the number of the core group, the number of the servants, the number of the livestock, everything. Now, I'm not completely sure why it is, but I've discovered in ministry that some individuals and churches fear records. I don't know why. There's something spiritual about like not knowing numbers. Does that sound like God to you? Because people run around and go, we're not about numbers. That's what people say when they don't feel like they're going to have good numbers. What church ever had 160 people saved in a service that didn't tell you 160 people got saved? See what I'm saying? And everybody's about numbers when the numbers are good, but we're not about numbers when numbers aren't good. Here's what I'm trying to say. Numbers just represent people. Are you about people? Then you're about numbers, because numbers represent people. Don't worry about don't walk around paranoid. How can we gauge the effectiveness of something? If 3 people show up to something for which we put thousands of dollars and thousands of hours work into, then we know it was ineffective. How do we know? Because 3 people showed up. It's not touching a need if it's not touching a need. There's nothing wrong with looking at that and facing that reality. You know what? Here's the thing. It happens all the time in ministry. You have to roll with the punches. You'll spend a great deal of time doing something, put something together, and it won't work. So what do? Oh, the ministry's over. No, you get up and you figure out what went wrong and you fix it, and you do it again the next time. It's part of making things work. I want you to notice there was a price to the new settlement. Do you see the price? It's in verses 70 to 73. What was the price? I think that 3 things you will notice right away. The first one is, I noticed that in verse 70, circle the word governor. The governor got out front. Good leaders give first. Good leaders give first. He's the leader, so he gave first. Second thing I noticed was in the word 71 and in verse 71, heads of the families. The chiefs of the families got on board when the governor got on board. So key families signaled acceptance. And then I go down to verse 72. Do you see where it says rest of the people? Guys, don't ever go into a meeting as a leader not knowing which way the meeting's going. Get with your leadership. Get with the heads of the families. Get with the people that you think are going to object and make sure that you've nailed down their objections before the meeting happens. Or walk into a meeting, be blindsided, and have the church walk out feeling like there was a big split. Don't ask the question if you don't know the answer. You can do all this behind the scenes, and that keeps peace in a church. I love that this book outlines some incredible ways in which Nehemiah sort of embodies an embracing leader. Remember at the beginning of the chapter, he put other people in charge, but they still looked to him to be in charge. So behind the scenes, he worked for a way to keep the thing together. Let me just close out chapter 7 and say that in a speech made in 1863, Abraham Lincoln said these words. I thought they were fabulous. He said, "We have been the recipients of the choicest bounties of heaven. We have been preserved these many years in peace and prosperity. We have grown in numbers, we have grown in wealth, and we've grown in power as no other nation has ever grown. But we have forgotten God. We have forgotten the gracious hand which preserved us in peace and multiplied and enriched and strengthened us. And we have vainly imagined in the deceitfulness of our own hearts that all these blessings were produced by some superior wisdom and virtue of our own. They were not." I think that's just brilliant, that he was smart enough to know that he wasn't smart enough to do the things that were being done.